They laughed as the veteran used a strange wooden fence to enclose 3 small wooden houses, saying that no fence could stop the wind and no design could fool winter. They watched silently as he worked with a limping German shepherd beside him, stacking wood ceiling gaps, building for a storm no one believed would come. In a remote valley in Wyoming, where winter had followed the same pattern for generations, people trusted the past more than warnings. They ignored him when he knocked on their doors. They smiled as he spoke of shifting winds, reversing pressure, and storms that wouldn't behave as they used to. Then the sky turned white. The wind came like a hammer blow. Roofs ripped off, doors flung open, heaters went out, power went out, and one by one houses that had stood for decades began to crumble. But inside the veteran's wooden shield, there was no howling wind, no creaking walls, only silence, warmth, and preparation. As the storm tightened, the laughter faded, and as night fell, the knocking began. Please comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. Your support is a huge motivation for us, so stay tuned. Winter arrived in Wyoming without ceremony, a clean white silence settling over the valley like a held breath, the kind that made even seasoned locals pause before stepping outside. Gideon Kessler arrived at dawn with a dented pickup, a German shepherd in the passenger seat, and no intention of explaining himself to anyone. He was 52 tall but slightly stooped from old injuries, with a frame that still carried the dense strength of a man trained to endure weight rather than display it. His beard was dark with threads of iron gray, trimmed close out of habit, not vanity. Deep lines cut from the corners of his eyes to his cheekbones, not from age alone, but from years of squinting into wind, sand, and uncertainty. His eyes were pale, almost washed out, the kind that missed very little and trusted even less. Gideon moved with economy, no wasted gestures, no hurry, like someone who had learned that speed without purpose only invited mistakes. Beside him sat Sable, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest and a coat of deep black fading into burnished gold along the legs and face. His left hind leg lagged a fraction behind the others, stiffened by an old injury that flared when the cold settled deep. One ear bore a small notch, and faint scars traced his flank beneath the fur, pale reminders of things neither he nor Gideon revisited aloud. Sable's eyes were dark and alert, tracking the valley as if cataloging threats and exits, before the truck engine had even cooled. They had come here to disappear. The valley lay tucked near the eastern edge of the Wind River Range, far enough from main roads that snow stayed where it fell, and silence was a constant companion. A scattering of wooden houses clung to the low slopes, smoke lifting lazily from chimneys, fences half buried in drifts. To most people it looked peaceful. To Gideon it looked exposed. He parked near the edge of town and stepped out, boots crunching softly on the packed snow. The wind slid through the valley in long searching fingers, testing gaps, whispering against walls. Gideon closed his eyes for a moment and listened, not with comfort but with assessment. The sound carried unevenly. Too much whine, too much pressure, not built for what's coming, he murmured. Sable's ears flicked and he leaned lightly against Gideon's leg, as if agreeing. Gideon had seen this before, not here, not with snow and pine, but in other places where structures failed because people trusted what had always worked instead of what was needed next. In the war, it was the difference between a wall that looked solid and one that could take a blast, between shelter and illusion. He walked the main path slowly, eyes tracing rooflines, angles, the way snow drifted against walls. Most of the houses were well kept, their wood-stained warm browns and reds, windows trimmed neatly. But the roofs were pitched shallow, the walls single-layered corners open to the prevailing wind. Beautiful, proud, vulnerable. The first door he knocked on belonged to a woman named Mara Ellison, though Gideon didn't know her name yet. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with wind-reddened skin and thick auburn hair pulled into a loose braid that hung over one shoulder. Her eyes were sharp but tired, the look of someone used to carrying responsibility quietly. She opened the door with a guarded smile, a mug of steaming coffee in her hand. "Yes?" she asked. "I'm new," Gideon said. "Just moved up the ridge. Wanted to mention something about your roof line." Her smile froze, then softened into polite amusement. "About my roof." "The wind comes straight off the pass," Gideon said calmly. "Your north corner's taking the full load. In a bad storm, it'll lift snow and drive it under the eaves. You might want a second windbreak or—" She laughed, not unkindly. "We've been here 12 winters, roof's still standing." "Winters are changing," Gideon replied. She took a sip of coffee, eyes flicking briefly to Sable, who sat perfectly still at Gideon's side. "They always change," she said. "But thank you, we'll manage." Gideon nodded once. "All right." He turned away without argument. Sable rose immediately, matching his pace. At the next house, a man named Roland Pike waved him off before Gideon finished his sentence. Roland was stocky, broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache frosted at the edges, and a voice that filled space easily. "Friend, I've lived in this valley longer than you've been alive," he said, chuckling. "Storms come, storms go. You don't need to teach us how to live with snow." Gideon absorbed the words without visible reaction. He had heard variations of them in deserts, mountains, floodplains. Confidence built on survival bias. The ones who didn't make it never spoke. He tried 2 more doors. One family smiled indulgently. Another barely listened. By midday, the wind sharpened, slicing colder through the gaps Gideon had already marked in his mind. Snow began to fall, fine and dry, carried sideways rather than down. Gideon stopped at the edge of town and looked back. Sable sat beside him, breath fogging the air, eyes tracking the subtle shift in the weather. "They don't hear it," Gideon said quietly. Sable's tail swayed, once slow and steady. On the walk back toward the ridge, Gideon's thoughts drifted not to anger, but to something heavier. He remembered another place where he had tried to warn people, another time when preparations were laughed at because the sky was still blue. He remembered the sound that came after. His jaw tightened, not in bitterness, but in resolve. He had not come here to save any. Not at first. He had come to find quiet, to build something small, solid, controllable. A place where the wind could scream itself hoarse without getting inside his bones. But standing there watching snow begin to erase the path he had walked in, Gideon accepted a truth he could not ignore. If he was right, then doing nothing would make him complicit. He turned toward the ridge and started climbing. Sable followed close, brushing against his knee, now and then grounding him. The dog moved carefully, favoring his injured leg, but there was no hesitation in his posture. Loyalty was not something Sable performed. It was simply how he existed. At the top of the rise, Gideon stopped and surveyed the land he had chosen. The wind behaved differently here, broken by natural contours, slowed by trees. He could already see it, 3 structures staggered, sheltered, wrapped in wood like armor. Quiet inside, no whistle, no howl. "They'll think I'm crazy," Gideon said to the open air. Sable looked up at him, eyes steady. "Let them," Gideon added. The first snow of the coming season thickened the valley, softening beneath its weight. Gideon stood there a long moment longer, listening to the wind speak in a language he understood too well, then turned his back on the town and walked home. He did not know yet how bad the storm would be, only that it would come. And when it did, laughter would not keep anyone warm. The first sound Gideon Kessler trusted was not silence, but its absence. The wind spoke before storms did, and now it spoke more often, pressing itself into corners, slipping through seams, testing what would bend and what would break. That was how Gideon knew it was time to stop warning and start building. He began before sunrise. The ridge above the valley was hard with frost. the soil stubborn beneath his boots. Gideon worked in layered motions, measuring with his eyes, pacing distances, with the quiet certainty of someone who had once calculated blast radii and fallback routes under fire. He did not sketch plans on paper. The design lived in his head, shaped by experience rather than aesthetics. 3 houses, not one, not spread apart but close enough to shield each other, offset from the prevailing wind, staggered so no single wall faced the full force of the gales rolling down from the Wind River Pass. Sable stayed near, always on the leeward side of Gideon's body, as if instinctively placing himself where he could block what the wind tried to steal. The dog's breath puffed white in the cold air, his injured hind legs stiffening as the temperature dropped. When Gideon paused to rest, Sable lowered himself carefully, never fully lying down, always ready. The first house went up simple and square, thick timber posts, driven deep walls, layered tight. Gideon chose wood with patience, rejecting boards that twisted under stress or rang hollow when struck. He spoke to no one while he worked, but his hands moved with deliberate rhythm, hammer blows steady, precise, each nail seated as if it mattered more than it did. In his mind, every joint was a promise. By the second week, the skeletons of all 3 houses stood shoulder to shoulder like sentries braced against an unseen enemy. Gideon then began the part that drew attention. He built the fence, not a decorative boundary, but a solid ring of interlocked timber, tall enough to break wind, close enough to trap drifting snow before it could pile against the houses themselves. The fence curved around the cluster, no sharp corners, no straight lines for the wind to grab. When Gideon stepped back, he tilted his head slightly, listening. The sound changed. The whistle softened. Above the houses, he constructed the final layer, the thing no one in the valley understood. A broad wooden canopy, slatted and woven, arched over the cluster like a rib cage. It did not seal the houses in. It embraced them. The outer layer took the brute force of the wind, scattering it, lifting it away. Beneath it, a calmer pocket formed an invisible space where air slowed and sound lost its teeth. Inside that pocket, Gideon lit the first small fire. The wood crackled gently, the sound contained comforting. The wind raged beyond the fence, but inside the cluster it was quiet. No howl, no shriek, just warmth settling where it was allowed to stay. Sable stepped closer to the hearth, circling once before lying down with a satisfied huff. His tail thumped the floor, once slow and deliberate approval given without ceremony. From the valley below, people noticed. Roland Pike came first, trudging up the path with his heavy coat, flapping breath loud in the cold. He stopped short at the fence hands, on his hips, squinting at the structure. Up close, his broad face looked more weathered than before, cheeks raw mustache, stiff with frost. His confidence was still there, but it no longer filled the space the way it had. "What in the world is this?" he asked, voice carrying an edge of disbelief. "A shelter," Gideon replied simply, setting another log in place. Roland let out a short laugh. "Looks like you're trying to cage yourself in. You afraid of the wind now?" Gideon didn't look up. "I respect it." Roland snorted, but his eyes kept drifting to the canopy overhead, the way snow slid off instead of piling. "You know, people are talking," he said, "saying you're building yourself a bunker." "Let them," Gideon said. Roland shifted his weight boots, scraping. "You really think it'll matter?" Gideon met his gaze, then pale eyes steady. "It already does." Roland had no answer for that. He muttered something under his breath and turned back toward the valley, shaking his head as he went. Others came after him, though fewer dared approach close. Mara Ellison watched from a distance one afternoon, her auburn braid tucked into her coat. Eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She said nothing, but Gideon noticed how she stood longer than she needed to, watching the way the fence broke the wind, the way smoke rose straight instead of being torn sideways. At night, Gideon sat alone inside the first house listening. The difference was unmistakable. Outside the fence, the wind clawed and scraped. Inside it softened to a distant murmur. The fire burned slower. The heat stayed. Still doubt crept in the way it always did when things seemed too controlled. Gideon woke one night to the sound of the canopy creaking, the timber flexing under a sudden gust. His body reacted before his thoughts, heart hammering, muscles tight. For a split second, the ridge dissolved into another place. Another time, canvas walls, snapping alarms, shouting, the ground trembling beneath his boots. Sable was on his feet, instantly pressing his weight into Gideon's leg, a low, steady presence anchoring him to the present. Gideon closed his eyes and breathed slow and deliberate until the images receded. "It's holding," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Sable's tail brushed the floor once. The next morning, Gideon reinforced the joints without hesitation, adding cross-bracing where the wood had sung too loudly under stress. He adjusted angles, thickened supports. The structure changed subtly, growing stronger without growing heavier. That was when the whispers in the valley shifted. People no longer laughed openly. They shook their heads, called it strange, unnecessary. Building a fortress for nothing, someone said at the trading post. Wind's always been here. But Gideon noticed something else. When the wind picked up in the afternoons, people lingered longer inside their homes. Fires burned hotter, smoke struggled, and once, just once, Gideon saw Mara Ellison standing in her yard, looking up at her roof with a crease between her brows. He did not approach her, not yet. He finished the cluster as the first heavy snow began to fall, flakes thick and wet, the kind that tested roofs and patience alike. Snow piled against the outer fence and stopped. Drifts formed where Gideon expected them to, harmlessly away from doors and walls. Inside the sheltered pocket, Sable slept deeply for the first time since they had arrived. His breathing slow, his injured legs stretched out without tension. Gideon watched him for a long moment, then stared into the fire. He thought of the valley below, of houses built for a world that no longer existed. He thought of warnings unheeded, of laughter that came easy when consequences were abstract. He felt no bitterness, only a quiet, heavy awareness. He had not built these houses for praise. He had built them because he understood what came after denial. Outside the fence, the wind gathered strength as if offended by the resistance. Gideon rose, added another log to the fire, and listened. The structure answered back, not with noise, but with calm, and Gideon Kessler allowed himself, for the first time since arriving, to believe that when the real storm came, this place would not fail. The ground beneath the first house was colder than Gideon expected, even for Wyoming. Frost crept deep into the soil, stiffening the earth, as if the valley itself were bracing for impact. Gideon felt it through the shovel handle before he saw it in the dirt. Resistance layered beneath resistance, the kind that demanded patience rather than force. He worked at night, not because he feared being seen, but because night carried fewer questions. The valley slept, the wind softened for a few hours, and Gideon could think without the weight of watching eyes. He pulled up the floorboards in the first house with practiced care, numbering each plank in pencil, setting them aside so they would fit back seamlessly. When the opening was finished, he descended into the earth, slowly carving a vertical shaft just wide enough for a man to move without panic. The soil changed as he went deeper. The top layer was brittle with cold, but below it the ground grew dense and damp, holding a faint, steady warmth. Gideon paused there, resting one gloved hand against the packed earth, feeling the temperature difference like a memory returning. In the war, this was how they survived nights when the cold cut deeper than bullets. Earth insulated. Earth endured. By the third night, the ham was deep enough. He reinforced the walls with timber braces set close, not trusting the soil alone, and packed clay between gaps until the space felt sealed, almost womb-like. The entrance was disguised beneath a removable section of floor, its seams hidden by a rug and a low wooden bench. Anyone stepping inside the house would never know what lay beneath unless Gideon chose to show them. Inside the ham, he worked with a methodical calm that bordered on ritual. He stacked thick wool blankets folded tight. He stored sealed water containers along the far wall, then crates of dried food beans, rice, jerky, nothing fragile, nothing wasted. A small oil lantern hung from a hook driven deep into the timber brace, its glass cleaned and ready. A medical kit sat within arm's reach, bandages, antiseptic inhalers salvaged from surplus supplies, painkillers measured and labeled. But the most careful work came last. Gideon laid out what he called the gradient. He marked zones along the ham's length, cooler, near the entrance, warmer, deeper inside, so no one would be forced from freezing air directly into heat. Children, the elderly, lungs already strained by cold. He had seen too many bodies fail, not from the cold itself, but from the shock of escaping it too quickly. This was not a bunker. It was a controlled descent into safety. Sable watched from the edge of the open floor, head-tilted eyes following Gideon's movements with focused interest. The dog rarely entered the ham, fully preferring to lie near the opening, guarding the space instinctively. His black and gold coat caught the lantern-light scars, pale beneath the fur, his injured hind leg tucked carefully beneath him. "You won't like it down there," Gideon said quietly, climbing back up. "Too still." Sable's tail flicked once agreement or acknowledgement. Gideon couldn't tell. By the time Gideon replaced the floorboards and swept away every trace of disturbance, dawn had begun to thin the darkness. He stood inside the house listening. The ham held the warmth, the silence, the promise. Later that morning, the forecast came through the radio. The voice crackled with unease, stripped of its usual casual confidence. "A delayed winter system," the announcer said. "Stronger than predicted. Pressure drop severe. Wind speeds exceeding historical averages. Temperatures plunging faster than models suggested. Whiteout conditions likely." Gideon turned the radio off before it finished. He knew. He stood at the edge of the valley road that afternoon, watching people move about their routines with the stubborn grace of those who believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Mara Ellison was hauling firewood, her auburn braid dusted with snow breath coming hard. She paused when she saw Gideon straightening slowly. "You look like you've got something to say," she called out. "I do," Gideon replied. "You should reinforce your north wall and your roof supports. Tonight, if you can." She frowned, lines deepening between her brows. "The forecast always sounds worse than it is." "Not this time." She studied his face, then really looked at him. The pale eyes, the stillness, the absence of exaggeration. Doubt flickered, but habit won. "We've got kids," she said. "We can't tear apart our house every time someone hears a bad report." Gideon nodded once. "Then at least prepare a warm interior room. Keep it sealed. No drafts." Mara hesitated, fingers tightening around the wood in her arms. "You sound very sure." "I am." She didn't respond right away. Snow began falling heavier around them, the flakes larger, more aggressive. "We'll be fine," she said finally, but the words lacked conviction. Roland Pike passed by not long after, his coat already crusted with ice at the shoulders. He gave Gideon a sharp look. "You spreading panic now, I'm spreading preparation," Roland snorted. "We've heard it all before." Gideon watched him go, the man's broad back already hunched against the rising wind. He felt no anger, only a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with cold. That night, the valley changed its breathing. Sable sensed it first. He lifted his head from the floor, ears snapping forward, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, but something in between. Gideon froze, the sound cutting through his thoughts like a signal flare. "What is it?" Gideon murmured. The wind outside had shifted. Not stronger yet, but wrong. Its rhythm had altered, gusts colliding instead of flowing, pressure stacking unevenly against the fence and canopy. Gideon stepped outside, pulling his coat tight, and listened. The wind spoke in broken sentences now. Sable stood beside him, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the dark slope above the ridge, as if watching an approaching figure only he could see. Gideon felt it settle into his bones. "This one's different," he said softly. He moved quickly after that, checking latches, reinforcing the canopy ties, sealing gaps along the inner fence. Inside the first house, he opened the ham entrance again, inspecting supplies, adjusting the lantern height, ensuring the gradient remained intact. Everything was ready. Too ready. He stood in the center of the room, hands resting on his hips, and waited for something he could not name. A memory stirred at the edge of his mind. Another night, another place where the air had behaved like this, just before everything went wrong. He pressed it down with practiced discipline. Sable returned to his side, pressing his shoulder into Gideon's thigh, steady and solid. The dog's breathing slowed, anchoring them both. "They won't listen," Gideon said quietly. Sable did not answer. He simply stayed. Snow thickened the flakes, now driven sideways, stinging against exposed skin. The valley lights flickered as the wind began to claw in earnest. Somewhere far off, a metallic bang echoed something tearing loose. Gideon closed the door and barred it, the sound of the wind dulling immediately. Inside, the fire burned steady, the warmth held where it belonged. The ham waited beneath their feet, silent, patient. Outside, the storm gathered itself, coiling for release. And in the quiet shelter of the first house, Gideon Kessler understood with grim certainty that when morning came, the valley would not look the same. The storm arrived at first light, without warning bells or gradual threats, the sky dimming as if someone had drawn a curtain across the world. Wind struck the valley like a hammer, not in gusts, but in blows, each one heavier than the last. Snow came sideways, thick and blinding, erasing fences, swallowing roads, flattening distance until even familiar shapes lost their names. Gideon Kessler was already awake. He stood inside the sheltered pocket of the three houses, coat on boots, laced, listening to the structure answer the wind. The outer canopy groaned, flexing like a ribcage under pressure. The fence caught the first wave of drifting snow and broke it apart. Inside, the air remained steady. Warmth stayed where it belonged. Sable pressed close to Gideon's leg, his body angled toward the door. Ears pinned forward, breath slow and deliberate. His injured hind leg trembled faintly, but he did not sit. He never sat when something was coming. By mid-morning, the valley below began to fail. A roof panel tore loose with a sound like a gunshot. Another followed. Doors banged open and slammed shut as the wind reversed direction without warning. Chimneys smoked backward, coughing ash into living rooms. The power went out in a staggered flicker, lights blinking once, twice, then surrendering to the white roar. Gideon watched from the narrow viewing slit he had cut into the fence, jaw-tight, eyes pale and unblinking. He did not move toward the valley, not yet. He understood the rhythm of collapse. Panic came before reason. Pride held on longer than warmth. By dusk, the road disappeared entirely, buried beneath a moving wall of snow. The temperature dropped so fast the air felt brittle, every breath sharp enough to sting. Inside the first house, Gideon stoked the fire carefully, keeping it moderate controlled. He checked the gradient in the ham below once more, then closed the entrance and barred the door. The first knock came just after dark. It was weak, uneven, barely audible over the storm, as if the sound itself was afraid to announce its need. Sable heard it first. His head snapped up, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Gideon crossed the room and unlatched the door. When he opened it, the wind tried to tear it from his hands. Larkin Vale stood in the threshold, hunched and shaking his shoulders, narrow beneath a coat too thin for the night. He was in his late 60s, with a sharp, angular face that once carried easy confidence, now drained of color. His beard was white, and untrimmed ice clinging to it in brittle clumps. One hand clutched a small figure pressed against his side. "This is my grandson Larkin," shouted over the wind, his voice cracking. Evan, the boy, was 6 or 7 small for his age, his cheeks blue with cold eyes, glassy with exhaustion. He wore a hat 2 sizes too big and gloves soaked through fingers stiff and unresponsive. Gideon stepped aside. "Come in." Slowly. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Sable moved forward, immediately pressing his warm body against Evan's legs, then circling once to block the worst of the draft, as Gideon shut the door behind them. The noise outside dulled instantly, reduced to a distant howl. Inside the pocket of calm, Larkin sagged, knees buckling as if the storm had been holding him upright until now. Gideon caught his arm, guiding him to a bench near the fire. "Sit," Gideon said. "Don't rush the heat." Larkin's breath came in ragged pulls. I thought we could make it through, like always." Gideon said nothing. He wrapped a blanket around Evan and nodded toward Sable, who lay down beside the boy without being asked, his flank pressed firmly against the child's legs. Evan's fingers curled weakly into the dog's fur, a small sound escaping his throat that might have been a sob or a sigh. The second knock came 10 minutes later, then the third. By the time the fourth knock rattled the door, Gideon no longer counted. People arrived in pairs and small clusters, faces, raw coats, torn eyes wide with a fear that had finally outpaced pride. Mara Ellison came with her 2 children, her auburn braid undone and plastered to her neck, her hands shaking as she tried to keep her voice steady. Roland Pike followed not long after, his broad shoulders hunched, mustache rimed with ice, the bluster gone from his posture. He would not meet Gideon's eyes. Gideon organized without raising his voice. Those showing signs of severe cold were guided into the first house closer to the fire. Those shivering but stable were sent to the second and third houses, where the warmth held steady and the wind was little more than a memory. Anyone panicking was seated near the hearth, instructed to breathe with the crackle of the wood, slow and even until their hands stopped shaking. Sable moved, constantly limping but tireless, checking each new arrival with a brief nudge. A press of warmth, a quiet presence that soothed without asking permission. He stayed close to children, and the elderly instinct guiding him where Gideon's eyes lingered longest. The storm did not ease, it intensified. Sometime after midnight, a section of roof collapsed in the valley with a thunderous crack that carried even through the wind. A woman cried out near the door, clutching her husband's arm. Gideon placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Stay," he said. "You're safe here." The words were simple, but they held. Larkin Vale sat hunched on the bench, staring into the fire as if seeing something far beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I said things," he muttered. "About you, about this place." Gideon knelt to adjust a log, eyes on the flame. "The wind doesn't care what people say," he replied. "Only what they build." Larkin swallowed hard, nodding once. Hours passed, measured not by time but by arrivals. A young couple with frostbitten hands, an older man whose generator had failed and whose stove had backdrafted smoke until his lungs burned, a woman carrying a cat wrapped inside her coat, the animal a gray, short-haired Tom no more than 3 years old, silent and wide-eyed, trembling until Sable lay nearby, his warmth and steady breathing calming it into stillness. The houses held. Snow piled against the outer fence and stopped. Wind screamed overhead, deflected by the canopy, broken into fragments that lost their force before reaching the doors. Inside, the air remained calm, the fire fed sparingly, the heat distributed carefully. Near dawn, the storm reached its peak. The world outside became nothing but sound and white motion. Gideon stood near the door, watching Sable make his rounds, pride gone, replaced by something quieter and heavier, responsibility. Roland Pike approached him then, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed red. "You were right," he said simply. "I was wrong." Gideon nodded. "Sit down," he said. "Save your strength." As the night dragged toward morning, the knocking slowed, then stopped. Those who had come now slept in scattered clusters wrapped in blankets, bodies angled toward warmth. Children breathed evenly. The elderly murmured softly in dreams. Sable finally lay down near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes still open. Gideon leaned against the wall, exhaustion pressing into his bones. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the storm spend itself against wood and design and stubborn preparation. When the wind began to weaken, it did so unevenly, like a giant losing interest. The silence that followed felt strange, almost louder than the storm itself. Gideon opened his eyes. The valley would wake to damage, to loss, to the truth that things had changed. But here, behind layered wood and quiet choices people had endured, and pride frozen brittle had finally shattered at the door. Morning did not arrive with sunlight. It arrived with silence, the kind of silence that followed devastation, heavy and uncertain, as if the valley itself was afraid to move. Gideon Kessler stood just inside the outer fence of the 3 houses, breath fogging faintly in the cold air, listening for sounds that did not come. No wind screamed through gaps, no boards rattled, only the soft crackle of embers settling inside the hearth behind him. Beyond the fence, the valley looked broken. Roofs lay peeled back like torn skin. A barn down the slope had collapsed inward, its beams twisted and half buried in snow. Trees that had stood for decades lay snapped and scattered their roots, clawing uselessly at the frozen earth. Fences had vanished entirely, swallowed by drifts that turned familiar paths into blank, deceptive plains. But the 3 houses behind Gideon stood unchanged. The wooden canopy had shed the snow cleanly, its slatted weave guiding the weight away without complaint. The fence remained upright, packed snow pressed harmlessly against its outer face. Inside the pocket the air was still, warm, intact. Sable stepped forward and sat beside Gideon, his broad chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. His injured hind legs shook faintly, exhaustion finally catching up to him, but his posture remained alert. Guarding was not something he did only during danger, it was who he was. Behind them, the people who had sheltered through the night began to stir. Mara Ellison emerged first, her auburn hair loose, now tangled from sleep, face pale but calm. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she took in the damage beyond the fence. Her 2 children stood close behind her, eyes wide, silent, in a way that suggested understanding had come too quickly. Roland Pike followed, moving slower than usual, his broad frame stiff, his mustache sagging with melted frost. He stopped beside Gideon without speaking, staring out at what remained of the valley. Where once he carried himself with easy certainty, now there was only weight. Larkin Vale stepped out last, leaning heavily on a walking stick Gideon had fashioned for him during the night. His sharp face looked older in the pale morning light, hollowed by more than cold. Evans stood at his side, bundled tightly, one hand resting on Sable's back as if afraid the warmth might vanish if he let go. For a long moment no one spoke. The truth did not need words. Finally Mara broke the silence. "We would have frozen," she said quietly, not as a confession but as a fact. Gideon nodded once. The storm was stronger than the houses were built for. Roland's swallowed jaw tightening. "We thought we knew this place," he muttered. "We thought the land played by the same rules it always had." "It doesn't anymore," Gideon replied. His voice held no blame, only clarity. Word spread quickly once people began moving. Neighbors who had not made it to the ridge emerged cautiously from damaged homes, drawn by the sight of smoke rising straight and calm from Gideon's cluster. They arrived with bowed heads and red-rimmed eyes, some limping, some carrying what little they could salvage. Gideon let them in without comment, offering warmth and water, guiding them through the fence the same way he had during the storm. By midday, a small crowd had gathered near the houses, not in panic now, but in something closer to awe. A man named Caleb Rourke stepped forward, tall and narrow-shouldered, his dark beard unevenly trimmed, eyes sharp with the restless energy of someone who fixed engines for a living. He had lost his workshop roof overnight. "I don't get it," he said, gesturing at the canopy. "No steel, no concrete, just wood." "Why didn't it fail?" Gideon considered him for a moment. "Because it wasn't trying to fight the wind," he said. "It was letting it pass." A woman named Eliza Moore, short and round-faced, with graying blonde hair tucked beneath a wool cap, nodded slowly. "You built space for the air," she said, "instead of sealing everything tight." "That's right," Gideon replied. "You give pressure somewhere to go, or it'll take it." They listened then, really listened. Gideon did not stand above them or lecture. He walked the perimeter, pointing out details as he went. The staggered placement of the houses, the curved fence with no corners for wind to grip, the canopy that broke force instead of absorbing it. He showed them where snow should be allowed to pile and where it must never collect. He explained how to reinforce roof joints, how to add a secondary wind wall without suffocating a structure. When someone asked about the ham, he hesitated only a moment before lifting the floor panel. He showed them the space beneath the packed earth walls, the careful layering of supplies. He explained the concept of thermal gradient, of slow warming, of protecting lungs and hearts as much as fingers and toes. "This isn't fear," he said, meeting their eyes. "This is respect for what the weather can do now." No one laughed. Larkin Vale cleared his throat, voice rough. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning to face Gideon fully. "Not just for what I said, for not listening." Others murmured agreement, heads bowed, hands clenched and unclenched as if the weight of pride was being set down piece by piece. Gideon shook his head. "Apologies don't rebuild roofs," he said. "Work does." That was when the shift truly happened. Caleb asked for measurements. Eliza asked for help reinforcing her home. Mara volunteered to organize supplies. Roland offered his tools, his truck, his time, without jokes, without conditions. By afternoon, the ridge buzzed with quiet purpose. Men and women moved carefully, deliberately, learning where to place boards, how to angle braces, how to leave room for air to move without stealing warmth. Gideon worked alongside them, his hands guiding rather than commanding. Sable stayed near the entrance, watching, tail thumping softly when children passed too close to drifting snow. The gray tomcat from the night before emerged from a coat sleeve and perched near the hearth, eyes half-lidded, utterly at peace. As the sun dipped low, painting the broken valley in pale gold, Gideon stepped back and surveyed the scene. People who had once avoided his gaze now met it openly. Gratitude sat in their faces, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Roland approached him quietly. "You could have left us to it," he said. "No one would have blamed you." Gideon looked at the houses, at the fence, at the people working within the space he had built. "I didn't build this to be alone," he said. "I built it because I knew what was coming." Roland nodded, understanding, finally settling in. As evening approached, the valley remained scarred but alive. Fires burned in repaired hearths, wind walls rose, children laughed softly, the sound tentative but real. Gideon stood by the gate as the last group headed back down the slope, armed with knowledge and borrowed tools. Mara paused beside him. "You didn't just save us," she said. "You taught us how to stay." Gideon inclined his head. Praise still sat awkwardly on him, but this felt different, useful. When the ridge grew quiet again, Sable returned to his familiar place by the door, sitting tall despite the tremor in his leg. Gideon rested a hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. The storm had changed the valley, but it had changed Gideon too. A man who had lived like shadow now stood in open light, not because he sought it, but because others needed something to gather around. And Sable, scarred and steadfast, remained at his post, a silent sentinel against whatever rule the world decided to rewrite next. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as a man who listens when the wind changes, as hands that prepare before fear becomes necessary, as a wounded dog who refuses to leave his post. In this story, the miracle was not the wood, the design, or the shelter. The miracle was foresight placed in a human heart. The Bible tells us that wisdom is a gift from God, often given quietly, often ignored until the storm comes. Gideon did not command the weather. He did not stop the storm. But God placed discernment in him, the ability to see danger before others felt it, and the courage to prepare even when mocked. That is how God often works in our daily lives. Not always by removing hardship, but by sending someone ahead of it. In our own lives, we meet storms too: illness, loneliness, sudden loss, uncertain futures. And many times the answer is not a miracle that changes the world, but a small inner voice urging us to prepare, to be kind, to build something that can shelter others when the time comes. Maybe you are that shelter for someone else. Maybe your patience, your wisdom, your quiet faith is the reason another person will survive their storm. If this story touched your heart even a little, please leave a simple comment below. Tell us where you are watching from today. Your words matter more than you know. They remind us that none of us stands alone. If you believe stories like this still belong in the world, please share this video and subscribe to the channel. Each story you support helps spread hope, courage, and compassion a little farther. And before you go, let us pause for a moment. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home from storms seen and unseen. May He give you wisdom when the wind changes strength, when the night is long, and peace that stays even when the world grows cold. God bless you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.